Welcome to the National Jazz Museum in Harlem's Jazz for Curious Listeners. My name is Lauren Schoenberg. I'm the senior scholar at the museum. And this particular series is called The Year in Jazz, and this time it's 1958. Simply put, the idea is that many times listening to music from 80, 70, 60 years ago, we only hear the most famous recordings from those years. But hearing those recordings up against the other music of the same year kind of helps us hear them in context. I think the lesser-known items make you appreciate the famous ones better, and vice versa. In 1928, of course, we had Louis Armstrong's West End Blues. But to hear 11 other recordings from the same year, it was really, really interesting. Same with 1938, 48. Here we are in 1958. It was an amazing year in jazz. You're going to hear such a wide variety of sounds from Sidney Bechet to Ornette Coleman. How about that? To start with, we'll begin with Ahmad Jamal's trio, a brilliant pianist out of Chicago, who had a new kind of radical conception of space and a new way that a rhythm section could sound, along with the drummer Vernel Fournier and the bassist Israel Crosby. They had a huge hit that year that really put them on the map on Point Siena. But we'll hear a very brisk version of a Surrey with the fringe on the top, up-tempo. Miles Davis and so many people were profoundly affected by this kind of jazz. It was really something new, and it's a great way to start our listening session to 1958. "1958 was a year of years for Duke Ellington. Ever since the summer of 1956, when his incredible appearance at the Newport Jazz Festival and the recording that came out of it had landed him on the cover of Time magazine. He was in a new renaissance in his career, and he did all kinds of wonderful projects, none more important than a new version of his 1943 extended composition Black, Brown, and Beige, Black, Brown, and Beige had never been recorded in its entirety. Decades later, a concert recording of the original premiere at Carnegie Hall in 1943 came out. But in all the years that followed, you couldn't hear the whole thing. He had recorded excerpts for Victor Records in 1944. He played, bits and pieces of it on the radio in different contexts and recorded a couple of things from it. But in 1958, he really kind of refashioned the whole thing, added a couple of new things like we're about to hear, and cut down other things, and it was recorded in stereo. It was a whole new project. And the crowning moment of it was the fact that he got Mahalia Jackson to participate. Mahalia Jackson, the gospel singer, had turned down every entreaty from popular music to somehow make a record that could sell like a pop record. She only sang in church and or for situations that she thought were commensurate with the way she thought of her religious music. And she agreed to sing with Ellington on this album. And you'll see the album cover. It's an incredible photo of the two of them. She sang Come Sunday, the beautiful spiritual theme, and this setting of the 23rd Psalm. There's not much to say about it, except it's extraordinary, and let's listen to it now.
Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want, making me to lie down in green pastures. For his name's sake. Though I walk through the valley, the shadows of death, I will fear no evil. Before me in the presence of my enemy. Thou anointest my head with oil, my cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord, in the house of the Lord forever and ever.
And now we modulate from Duke Ellington and Mahalia Jackson to Ornette Coleman and his very first recording session as a leader. It was done out on the West Coast. He had been in around Los Angeles for quite some time at that point. And the album was called Something Else, and it really was. It was kind of unusual because it featured Ornette Coleman and his classic frontline partner Don Cherry, who played the pocket trumpet, with a rhythm section that included a piano. And eventually, after some wonderful experiments with Paul Bley, Ornette Coleman was to shed the piano forever. He didn't record with the piano for many, many years until he made a great record session with Jerry Allen in the 1980s. But this is from the very first sessions that they did that people around the world heard, and it really eventually created quite a shock and then quite a profound influence. Billy Higgins is on drums. Don Payne is the bassist. Walter Norris, piano, wonderful musician who eventually wound up in Europe for decades. And again, that front line of Don Cherry and Ornette Coleman, about which at the time people like John Lewis and Gunther Schuller were very, very fervent admirers. Specifically, John Lewis said that he heard blues, old blues in Ornette Coleman, and also that the combination of trumpet and alto was so perfect, the intonation and phrasing and blend. They said really hadn't heard anything like that since Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie. This is The Disguise. Something Else by Ornette Coleman, recorded, as we mentioned, in L.A. In February 1958. Just a couple of weeks later, on the East Coast, another alto saxophonist made a record with the same personnel, not the same personnel, the same instrumentation, I should say. And it's one of the all-time great albums, as are so many of the albums in this presentation. This was called Something Else, and it featured Cannonball Adderley. Now, Cannonball had come up from Florida to New York with his brother Nat in 1955. They created a sensation. He made a lot of records. He formed a band with his brother. And for a variety of reasons, the band didn't really take off. And so he accepted Miles Davis's offer to join his band. In 1958, made some incredibly classic recordings, Milestones and Kinda Blue, and that really set Cannonball Adderley up as a leader, which he did for the rest of his life. However, early on in 58, Cannonball Adderley made a record in which Miles Davis appeared as a sideman, and that's very, very unusual. Very few examples of Miles once he became so famous, deigning to record under someone else's name, but he believed so much in Cannonball that he did it, and the album is amazing. Art Blakey is on drums, Sam Jones is on bass, a Florida buddy of Cannonball's, the great Hank Jones on piano. You know, Hank Jones influenced Oscar Peterson, he influenced George Shearing, so many other people. A brilliant musician, as deep as they get, and as influential as they get, and a lovely, lovely man. And it's hard to think of a record, and he made hundreds of great jazz records that show the breadth and depth of his great musicianship as much as this album does. The most famous title is Autumn Leaves. And if you haven't heard that yet, as soon as we're done with this, you must hear that. It's one of the great tracks. We're going to hear something kind of rare, a track that was recorded for the album that did not come out. There just wasn't room for it. But they found the tape, they reissued it later on, and we're going to hear this lesser-known title from this classic session. It's called Allison's Uncle, Miles Davis and Cannonball Adderley. from Miles Davis, we'll go to one of his great influences, someone who he said, famously, played everything you could ever play on the trumpet, even modern. And I guess by that he meant that you can go back to Louis Armstrong and hear anything and everything that's happened in jazz, in concept and sometimes literally. We'll catch Louis Armstrong in '58. This will be one of two videos that we'll see, or actually what were kinescopes, films of TV appearances. This is a wonderful band. It's Louis Armstrong on television, accompanied by Cozy Cole on the drums, who had been in his band earlier on, Chubby Jackson on the bass, Marty Napoleon, longtime Armstrong pianist, wonderful man. He plays. And the front line, a New Orleans clarinetist that was almost as old as Louis Armstrong, maybe even older. I have to look it up and see what year he was born, but he was Louis's contemporary, let's put it that way. His name is Tony Parenti, and he recorded under his own name as a leader very early on, before Louis Armstrong did. Came to New York, played with a variety of bands, never really established a big name for himself, but whoa, was he a wonderful clarinetist. Jack Teagarden on trombone, one of Louis's closest musical companions. Boy, they play together so well and sing together, as you'll see. And on trumpet, a young guy from Boston who was just about 30 years old at the time, named Ruby Braff, who adored Louis Armstrong. And I think you'll enjoy the beginning of this thing, where Ruby plays, and here's an echo to his trumpet playing, and it's Louis Armstrong off stage, and you hear the majesty of Armstrong's sound even before he appears. This is a relatively short but incredible performance of Jeepers Creepers from April 30th, 1958.
Where'd you get those beavers?
Oh, jeepers, creepers, where did you get those eyes?
God, get up. How'd you get so lit up?
Oh, gosh, I'll get up. How did you get that size? Yeah.
Golly gee, when you turn those heaters on.
Oh, it's me. Got to put my cheaters on.
Jeepers, creepers, where'd you get those beavers?
Oh, those weavers, where did you get those eyes?
Yeah, where did you get those eyes?
Oh,
Jeepers, creepers, where'd you get those heaters?
oh, yeah.
Oh, get up.
Oh,
Where did you get those eyes?
I say, gosh, all lit up.
Yeah.
Blood gets so lit up.
Oh, yeah.
I got all to get up. Tell me how to hit that side.
Golly gee, when you turn those heaters on.
Oh, it's me.
Yeah. Jeepers, creepers,
Oh, man.
where'd you get those beavers? Oh, those beavers, how they hypnotize. Where'd you get those eyes?
At the time this session was recorded in May 1958, Gil Evans had already recorded one classic big band, large ensemble record, Miles Davis, of course, and was just about to do another one. They were preparing for Porgy and Bess, and then Sketches of Spain would follow. But Gil Evans did some albums on his own with his incredible orchestrations, totally original way of imagining music. He had been the arranger for the Claude Thornhill Band, of which Miles Davis and John Lewis and folks like that, and Thelonious Monk actually, were huge fans. And he left Thornhill, made these records with Miles. He was struggling actually in the years leading up to the mid-1950s, and then got the green light to do some albums under his own name. This is one that was called Old Wine, New Bottles, and the idea was that he would take classic jazz compositions from the past, mostly the way past in 1958, and put them in contemporary setting, with Cannonball Adderley playing a lot of the solos, but some other folks, including trumpeter Johnny Coles, also getting some solo space. The pianist is Gil Evans himself. You'll hear him on the introduction here. He sounds really great. This is a tune called Willow Tree, famously recorded by James P. Johnson and Fats Waller back in the 1920s. It's kind of lesser known. There have not been that many recordings of it. And this Gil Evans recording is really something. From the Miles Davis band, we have Paul Chambers and Philly Joe Jones in the rhythm section. And you'll see the personnel listing as we listen to the music, as we are for all the titles in this series. More 1958 music. Max Roach was already one of the giants of jazz drums in 1958. You know, his great records with Charlie Parker in the 40s and many other people. And his band with Clifford Brown in 1954 through Clifford's early death in 1956, you know, had just been one of the greatest groups of all time. They recorded prolifically. And Max Roach had to rebound from the loss of his great trumpet player and found another great trumpet player eventually to take his place. Well, Kenny Dorham had been in there too, but he was already a well-established leader of jazz trumpet. But he found a wonderful musician named Booker Little. And Booker Little joined Max Roach's band in 1958 after a very strong recommendation. And he joined a band that included George Coleman on the tenor. Mr. Coleman still very much with us. The only surviving member of this band, Eddie Baker on the piano, Bob Cranshaw bass, Max Roach on drums, and again, the young Booker Little is on trumpet. There had been an album called Max Roach Plus 4 that was done for MRC a couple of years earlier, actually just about a year earlier, with Kenny Dorham and Sonny Rollins. This one was called Max Roach Plus 4 with music from Chicago. That was the basic idea, that these were musicians he had encountered in and around Chicago. It's a young band. It's a fascinating band. It's music that's not heard that much. And so I'm so glad that we will listen to Memo to Maurice from this session. And this was done on June 3rd, 1958. Some wonderful drumming here. And by the way, we're going to hear later on in the show some features for Art Blakey, some features for Roy Haynes. So we really get a nice dose of 1958 drumming on this session. one of the most astounding things about 1958 was that Ornette Coleman was to make his first recordings, and Sidney Bechet and Armstrong and people like that and Willie the Lion Smith were still very active and very creative at that time. It's kind of what we see in the famous photo, which was taken the same year, actually, just about this time, what's known as the Great Day in Harlem jazz photograph taken on 126th Street in Harlem, that actually was done for Esquire magazine. And in it you see Lucky Roberts and Willie the Lion Smith. Well, they were there. The Lion actually did not wind up in the famous photograph, with, Gene Krupa and Joe Jones and Sudie Singleton and Sonny Rollins and Charles Mingus and Lester Young and Coleman Hawkins and Oscar Pettiford and Mary Lou Williams. We could name that whole incredible photograph. And what it really means is that, jazz had evolved so rapidly since the early 20th century up through 1960 or so. Of course, it's still evolving till today in many different ways. But that first spurt of genius and growth, it happens in many art forms and in many genres where there's a huge spurt, let's put it that way, at the beginning of genius when something new happens. Of course, jazz was as old as it was new. But this next session is fascinating. This is another film of a concert done in France in 1958, and it features Sidney Bechet on the soprano sax. Again, Bechet, older than Armstrong, toured Europe and got great reviews for introducing jazz, real jazz, if you want to call it that, to Europe in 1919. He eventually expatriated to France in the late 40s and early 50s, became a beloved elder pop star with a big hit record called Petite Fleur, and lived the life as a famous musician in a way in France that he never would have in the United States. We'll catch him along with a bunch of U.S. players who were over in Europe for this festival. Teddy Buckner on trumpet. He was from the West Coast and was a Louis Armstrong-styled trumpet player, wonderful musician. Vic Dickinson is on trombone, and he's a trombonist, not known to the general public like some of his other peers, like Dickie Wells or Jack Teagarden, people like that, or even others, but mention his name to a trombonist, and their eyes always light up because he had a great sense of humor, an incredible beat, an original sound, and was a real master. And he had a wonderful, long association with Bechet. There are wonderful records of a band with just Bechet and trombone. I mean, soprano, sax, and trombone is not the usual front line for a band. I urge you to try and find those records. Sammy Price, boogie-woogie pianist from Texas, is here. Arvell Shaw, a wonderful bassist who had come to fame with Louis Armstrong's All-Stars, and he was in and out of that band for 20 years plus. And on drums, you ready for this? Roy Eldridge. Yes, Roy was at the festival, played some great sets with Coleman Hawkins and others. He was also a very good drummer. And here he really pulls out what you might call like pre-swing era drumming, like how somebody would have drummed in 1929 or something like that. And it's fascinating. He has a great beat, and you can see him so clearly, and it looks like the musicians got a real boot out of Roy playing the drums. So just another spice in this 1928 musical concoction. 1958 found Billie Holiday, Carmen McRae, Sarah Vaughan, Helen Merrill, Teddy King, Dinah Washington, Barbara Lee, just for starters, Lee Wiley, Ethel Waters was still singing. I mean, when you think of the great original jazz singers who were singing in 1958, it's kind of amazing. It would be a wonderful thing just to spend. You could spend a month just listening to their records alone. We'll check out vocalists with Carmen McRae, who was a wonderful pianist, great musician. She wrote some wonderful tunes. She'd been married to the drummer Kenny Clarke. Fascinating background. It was an early friend of Billie Holiday's. In fact, Billie Holiday recorded some tunes while Carmen McRae was still a teenager that Carmen had written. Absolutely fascinating musician. And she did an album for Decca Records called Birds of a Feather, in which each tune had something to do with a bird, obviously. And this is a lesser-known tune. It's a beautiful song called Baltimore Oriole. And the tenor saxophone solo is by the one and only Ben Webster. It's arranged by Ralph Burns, and it's another 1958 classic for you, August 8th, 58.
No life for a lady to be dragging her feathers around in the snow, leaving her mate. She flew straight to the Tangipahoe, where a two-timing blackbird the divine Miss Ho. I'd like to ruffle his plumage, Baltimore Oriole, messed around with that big mouth till he singed her wing. Forgiving is easy, it's a woman-like now and then could happen thing. Send her back home. Home ain't home without her warbling. Make a lonely man happy, Baltimore from that bough, fly back to me now. Send her back home. Home ain't home without her warbling. Make a lonely man happy, Baltimore Oriole. Come down from that bough, Baltimore,
There were a handful of jazz composers slash arrangers who were really gaining a foothold in jazz in the 1950s. I mean, we always talk about Ellington. In the 1940s, people like Tad Dameron came to fame. There were the people who wrote for Stan Kenton's band, the folks around Dizzy Gillespie's orchestra. And one musician who really came into his own just, I'd say probably around 1956 or so, was George Russell. George Russell had played the trumpet. He played the drums, believe it or not, in Benny Carter's big band. His place was taken by Max Roach. But he eventually gave up playing for a living and became a full-time composer and started doing albums in the mid-50s for RCA with the Jazz Workshop series. George Russell's music sounds like no one else's, a true original. And he made a handful of recordings with a much larger ensemble. He had his own band, which was a sextet, famous records with Eric Dolphy playing with him and David Baker and all kinds of wonderful musicians, Steve Swallow. But this was a larger ensemble, George Russell and his orchestra, a session from September 12th, 1958. The album was called New York, New York, and it was a profile of New York and all of its grandeur and complications. The narrator here is John Hendricks. Of course, the composer is George Russell, and we will hear solos from an incredible lineup, including trumpeter Art Farmer, Bob Brookmeyer on the trombone, John Coltrane on the tenor, Bill Evans on the piano, and the drummer recently passed away. He was a stalwart of the jazz scene, great teacher, band leader, a beloved person on the scene, the great Charlie Persip. And this is Manhattan from George Russell's New York, New York. And again, one of the things I love about these shows of going month by month through a given year is listening to the breadth of music, of expression, of originality. And I think each performance benefits the one that came before it and the one that came after it in a certain kind of way. Anyway, here's some very original music for you.
Think you can lick it? Get to the wicket. Buy you a ticket. Go! Go by bus, by plane, by car, by train. New York, New York. What they call a something else town. A city of more than 8 million people with 1 million people passing through every day. Some come just to visit, and some come to stay. If you scuffle hard enough, and you ain't no dunce, you can always get by in New York City, I heard somebody say once. Yeah, if you can't make it in New York City, man, you can't make it nowhere. So where do people come to scuffle? Right here. Think you can lick it? Get to the wicket. Buy you a ticket. Go! New York, New York. A city so nice they had to name it twice. It may seem like a cold town, but man, let me tell you, it's a soul town. It ain't a bit hard to find someone who's lonesome or forlorn here, but it's like finding a needle in a haystack to find somebody who was born here. New York, New York, a something else town, all right. East side, west side, uptown, downtown. There's one thing all New York City has, and that's jazz. A while ago, there were cats reading while cats played jazz behind them, but wasn't nothing happening, so the musicians cooked right on like they didn't even mind them. I wrote the shortest jazz poem ever heard. Nothing about hugging or kissing. One word. Listen.
Many of the bands that we've been listening to were put together for a recording date, a special project, a concert. Right now we're going to go to one of the most popular and influential jazz bands of all time that was really hitting one of their first peaks at this time, and that's Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers. Blakey was originally a pianist. He came of musical age in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, picked up the drums, played in Fletcher Henderson's band, and then eventually with Billy Eckstine's big band, where he met Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie. Stayed with Billy Eckstine for a while, had a long association starting in the mid-40s with Thelonious Monk, and started a big band of his own called the Jazz Messengers in the late 40s, eventually putting together a band with Horace Silver. They went their own way, and Blakey kept the name the Jazz Messengers and became one of the great band leaders. He was already one of the great drummers of all time. And talent scouts. So many great musicians came out of these Blakey bands. Well, I'm not sure if it's his best-selling album ever, but certainly one of them at the very top of the list that was so popular was called Moanin', and it was recorded in late 1958. There was a session on October 30th, 1958 that featured compositions by his musical director, and a man who survives well into his 90s now. He's one of the great statesmen of jazz, the great Benny Golson. And all the tunes on the album were written by Benny Golson, except for the title track, Moanin', which was written by the group's pianist, Bobby Timmons. Jimmy Merritt is on the bass. Lee Morgan, just out of his teenage years, on the trumpet, and Mr. Golson on the tenor saxophone. Now, at this session, out of which the classic LP Moanin' came out, there was more material recorded than originally could be fit on the album. This is called the Drum Thunder Suite, and it's a great Benny Golson piece. 3 short movements: Drum Thunder, Cry a Blue Tear, and Harlem's Disciples. And as mentioned before, we've heard from Max Roach. Now we're hearing from Art Blakey. We're about to hear from Roy Haynes. Just a percussion spotlight on what was happening in 1958. This is really some amazing music, and probably not heard it before. Another great drummer of the 1950s, in fact, he's a great drummer as we record this in late 2020, is Roy Haynes. And Roy Haynes, although he was only in his early 30s in 1958, was already a great veteran, having played with Lester Young and Charlie Parker, several years with Sarah Vaughan, great records with Miles Davis and Fats Navarro and Tad Dameron and all kinds of musicians, and was to become a band leader in the 1960s, a wonderful band called the Hip Ensemble later on. And like Art Blakey, became a mentor to young players playing in his band, many of whom went off on their own. We're going to catch him in his first appearance as a leader on an American jazz record date. And this is recorded November 14th, 1958. And he has two youngsters with him, Paul Chambers, just into his 20s. Chambers had come to New York from Detroit around 1954, played with Lester Young, played with Kay Wending and J.J. Johnson's band, many other groups, and then wound up with the famous Miles Davis Quintet. He was to stay with Miles Davis for many years, and he's one of the landmark, if that's the word, bass players in swinging jazz music. Any bass player who wants to play that kind of music, at some point they have to deal with Paul Chambers. He remains a real titan. And on the piano, another young musician from Memphis, Tennessee, who was known for his brilliant, almost scary versatility, technique on the piano. When you read his name, it's Phineas Newborn Jr. However, musicians who know him, everyone in the jazz world always refers to him as Finus. That's how they pronounced it, Finus Newborn. And he could really be, so much on the piano. This record with Roy Haynes finds him a little more reserved than usual. It's a fascinating recording. And we'll listen to Tad Dameron's Our Delight, which has wonderful drums, as does every track on the record, from the great Roy Haynes. We've not heard that many big bands during this review of 1958, and this is as good a time as any. Just to mention that undoubtedly some folks listening to this presentation have some favorite 1958 musicians that they've not heard, and you can only have so many selections in a show like this, and it was such an incredible year for jazz that I'm sure we've left a lot of things out that we could have included, but I hope you enjoyed the juxtaposition of all these tracks one upon another that I think really does help us hear the music in a new way. To get to the great big bands, we heard Ellington, and now we're going to hear Count Basie. And this is from an album called Chairman of the Board. The Basie Band was recording it all throughout 1958, a session in March, and then these sessions done between the 10th and 12th of December 1958. And the one that we've chosen is called Speaking of Sounds, and it's written by the band's trumpeter Thad Jones. Now, Thad was the middle brother of the Jones brothers. The oldest one was Hank Jones, who we heard play with Miles Davis on the second track from the album Something Else on the Cannonball Adderley's record with Miles Davis. The younger brother was Elvin Jones, the drummer, who in 58 was working with Stan Getz somewhat and working with with J.J. Johnson's band, and also would go to John Coltrane in a short amount of time and revolutionized jazz drumming. Well, Thad Jones really kind of revolutionized big band writing. He had his own style. And although he was with Count Basie for quite a while, Basie didn't record that much of his music because it was more Thad Jones than Count Basie. This album, Chairman of the Board, features great arrangements by Frank West and Frank Foster, who you'll see on the cover of the album in just a moment. Also, Ernie Wilkins was another arranger who wrote for the Basie Band. Thad's things wound up not being recorded for the most part, and it was those arrangements that formed the basic library of what became the Thad Jones Mel Lewis Jazz Orchestra of the mid-60s that changed the sound of big band jazz forever. Featured on this recording is Thad on the trumpet, his old friend and band leader actually from their Detroit days, a great player, rarely talked about enough, and that is Billy Mitchell. He's on the tenor with the great Basie Band playing Thad Jones. Well, we go from a big band to a quartet for our last track in 1958. This is from December 23rd of 58, and it's one of Jerry Mulligan's great quartets. Mulligan played the clarinet, the alto saxophone, the tenor, the baritone. In his early years around Philadelphia, he had been in Elliot Lawrence's band. He had been in Gene Krupa's band. He was a major player in the Miles Davis Nonette, became known as the Birth of the Cool, and really kind of launched out as a leader. He had his own thing in mind. And after coming out of the big bands, he eventually started a quartet that was famous for not having a chord instrument. There was no piano, there was no guitar. It was two horns, bass, and drums. The first quartet that really got famous was with Chet Baker on the trumpet, and then another trumpet player named John Erdley came in, and Chet Baker came back for a hot second. And the next great quartet, well, he had one with Bob Brookmeyer on the valve trombone. We heard Bob Brookmeyer back with George Russell. But when Art Farmer joined Jerry Mulligan for a relatively short period in the late 50s, it was a high watermark of this kind of lyrical and this kind of Jerry Mulligan jazz. Their Columbia album, What Is There to Say, is a classic among classics, as is everything that we heard in this show. And we'll hear As Catch Can. Bill Crow on the bass. Bill, not only a great musician, but a great author and a beloved presence on the jazz scene, still very much with us here in the fall of 2020. He's very active on Facebook and a wonderful man. Dave Bailey is the drummer, another great musician. And with this, we'll conclude our listening session to music from the year 1958. Thank you for listening to this edition of Jazz for Curious Listeners, The Year in Jazz 1958. My name is Lauren Schoenberg. I'm the senior scholar at the National Jazz Museum in Harlem, and on behalf of our staff, our board, our volunteers, everyone, we want to thank you for joining us, not only for this presentation, but hopefully for a lot of our other things that we do as well. They live on Facebook Live and more these days on our YouTube channel. The National Jazz Museum in Harlem YouTube channel has many of our programs. They're not all necessarily educational, as this one is, or based in music of the past. Many are contemporary musicians, contemporary issues, all kinds of fascinating things that reflect the 360-degree view of the world of jazz and beyond as it exists now. Again, thank you for your support. If you'd like to support the museum financially or in any other way, please go to our website at www.jmih.org. That's for Jazz Museum in Harlem, and we'll see you next time.